Perfect. Friends, good evening. Before I say anything else, I'll do the rather dull but important housekeeping, which is there are more people that have booked than are currently in the room, which means there'll be some people either coming through security or running late. We'll get everybody in as quietly as we can, but if the only seats in your row that are empty are right in the middle, that will mean a slight kerfuffle and a stepping on the toes, the traditional stepping on the toes. So my recommendation is if you can leave seats nearer the end of the aisle free, it will make it a lot easier for our ushers to get people in. Thank you. It's also a good opportunity to remind you, please, if your phones are not on silent or airplane mode or off altogether, then please, now's the time to do so. And any flash on your phones turned off, that'll be really helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, so friends, good evening, and welcome to JW3, the home for Jewish culture and conversation. I'm Raymond Simonson. It's my great privilege to be the CEO of this, the only Jewish community centre and cultural venue of its kind in the UK. Now, like most of you, I'm sure, I've spent every day of the past 12 months living under the huge shadow of October the 7th. My professional life, my personal life, conversations with family and friends, the articles I read, the podcasts I consume, it's there all the time. And in those moments where it's turned off, when watching a film, when watching a football match, it comes back very quickly the moment that finishes. This week alone at JW3, we're hosting multiple events for all kinds of different audiences marking the first anniversary. Over the last couple of hours, there's been over 200 Israelis here watching the live stream of the official memorial ceremony from Israel. There are over 250 young adults, you will have seen them on your way in their 20s and 30s. They're out in our Dorfman Piazza for a memorial event. There's been survivors from the Nova Festival here. There's been families of hostage members here in recent days. But I'm especially pleased to be here in this auditorium with you all this evening for some high-quality conversation and reflection with our partners, LCSCA, the London Centre for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and the Jewish Literary Foundation. I'm sure you know the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism challenges the intellectual underpinnings of anti-Semitism. Scholars of anti-Semitism and those in disciplines where anti-Semitism has become acceptable are more and more excluded from universities. The LCSCA maintains communities of scholarship so that we can maintain and strengthen our place as Jews inside academia, because there's no good strategy for fighting anti-Semitism that gives up on the universities. And the Jewish Literary Foundation presents the best in literature and ideas through their events, helping to build a lifelong passion for the Jewish literary tradition. Besides their flagship annual Book Week Festival that I'm sure we all attend, the Foundation runs events and educational programs throughout the year and hosts a growing free online digital archive of discussions with the world's leading writers and thinkers. As I'm sure you all know, the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism has published a 3-volume anthology of responses to the 7th of October and its aftermath from key intellectuals and academics around the world. And this evening, the Centre's CEO, David Hirsh, along with Professor Anthony Julius and Dr Linda Maizels, will share their reflections with us on this most difficult of years. We will end the event around 8:30, and then there'll be a chance after to purchase the books. If you go back through the doors into the restaurant area, you'll be able to purchase the books if you like, and they'll be available to be signed if you wish. And we invite you then to continue the conversation at our cafe onwards. Everything you hear this evening is a trigger for continued conversations. I've been asked to let you know, if you haven't noticed, there is a photographer taking photos tonight. If you don't want to be in any photos that are published anywhere, please make sure you let the photographer know. The photographer is over here. Just give us a wave. There we go. So just let him know on your way out that you don't want to be in any photos. So that's it from me. I now ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to this evening's moderator, a great friend to JW3, Rabbi Baroness Julia Neuberger DBE, who is many things, a British rabbi, a crossbench peer, social commentator and writer, and many more. She was the senior rabbi at West London Synagogue and one of the first 2 female rabbis in the UK. So most importantly, she has been immortalised in our London Jewish mural, the UK's largest ever Jewish mural, which you will have seen proudly on show on the side of our building. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I showed my children and my grandchildren the portrait of me that's on the side of the building here, and they said it didn't look at all like me, which I have to say I was somewhat relieved by. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening. This is quite a somber topic. Gosh, is the lighting going to be like this all the time? It's going to be difficult to see. I can't see all of you except the front row, so I'll pay a lot of attention to you in the front row. Let me just say a bit about what we're going to do. We have 3 real experts here with us tonight, and I'm going to ask each of them to, if you like, lay out a bit of their thinking on what has happened over the last year, and in a sense how they feel about it as well. I'm particularly going to ask Linda, possibly later in some of the discussion, to talk about the American experience, which is different from the UK experience, but related, and I think that's really important. They've each got about 7 minutes, and I'm quite strict about timing. And what we'll then do is have a discussion between the 3 of them. And then you get a chance. Now, I don't know how to put this to you. We have a Jewish audience here. But actually, could we have questions, not comments and commentary? That would be really wonderful. And we won't have hugely long for questions, real questions. But then what we will be doing is giving them each about 2 minutes, just with final thoughts, final reflections, and you'll get a chance to talk to all of them afterwards if you'd like to. So let me do some introductions. So I'm going to do it in order of people speaking. So David Hirsh is going to start, senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths. He describes himself as a Jew and a lifelong racist. We'd sort of thought you were Jewish. And an expert on anti-Semitism, which he certainly is, author of Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, advisory editor of the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. He has been working on this issue for a very long time, but particularly pioneered the sociological account of contemporary anti-Zionism and how it relates to anti-Semitism. And I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. He's also been one of the editors of these 3 volumes, and I have to say that they're fantastic, those volumes. Really good, short, punchy, informative stuff you didn't necessarily know. Then he's going to be followed by Dr. Linda Maizels. She's an independent scholar and researcher on anti-Semitism, adjunct faculty member at the Spertus Institute, where she teaches a course on anti-Semitism for the MA in Jewish Professional Studies, and she lectures for the Leadership Certificate in Combating Anti-Semitism. She's also a member of the Advisory Council for the Brandeis University Presidential Initiative to Counter Anti-Semitism in Higher Education, and she's a senior research fellow at the Programme on Extremism at George Washington University. And she will have some reflections that will be different from a UK perspective, and I think that's important for us to hear. And last, but by no means least, Professor Anthony Julius, one of the UK's most senior lawyers, who's chairing a new organisation, Intracommunal Professorial Group, amidst the huge rise in anti-Semitism since the 7th of October, and it's been established to record and analyse the experiences of Jewish students, academics, and other staff on university campuses. But he also wants me to tell you, this is really important, that he's just written a biography of Abraham, the first Jew. I thought, actually, that Jacob was the first Jew, but who am I? And I'll read the book, and he wants you to know that it's available for pre-order on Amazon. So, without more ado, I'm going to hand over to David, and the only role I'm going to play for the next 20 minutes or so is timekeeping.
Thank you very, very much. So the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is, as was introduced by Raymond, we're all struck by the events of the 7th of October differently. But everybody has a feeling that something very, very important happened that day, that it was a watershed day, that the time before was different from the time after. And I share that feeling, and I always shared that feeling, but I spent some time, and I'm still spending some time, puzzling over exactly why and exactly what was unique or completely unprecedented about the 7th of October. Because, of course, there is a long history of anti-Semitism, and there is a long history of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. In 1948 and 1967 and 1973, Israel was attacked not by a kind of paramilitary force with Toyota pickup trucks, but by Arab League states with tanks and artillery and air cover. And that was big, I think. Interestingly, one of the things that we always said about that was that if one of those occasions had led to a victory over Israel, to the defeat of Israel, then that would likely lead to a lot of Jewish lives being at risk. And I think a lot of people kind of heard us but didn't quite believe us. And when we said that the Jews of Israel needed the capacity for self-defense, and when we said that part of the issue was about anti-Semitism, I think people were skeptical. So one of the things that I think people thought on the 7th of October was that now people will understand. Now people have had the opportunity to see what it looks like when Israelis are murdered systematically, as many as can be reached. And of course, we all know that, and I don't want to exaggerate this either, because we know that a lot of people didn't see it. It's also true that a lot of people did see it. In fact, the polling is quite interesting. The polling tells us that about 25% of Brits agree with anti-Semitic proposals like Israel does to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews, so about 25%. About 25%, on the other hand, are very clear that they were sympathetic to Israel and Israelis and are also very worried about anti-Semitism, and about 50% in the middle don't know, don't care, not sure. So it's not a story of complete horror, but the 25% is important. It is overrepresented in the universities, in the caring professions, in the arts, in teaching, and I think in journalism, and also amongst young people. So having said that, there were many people who did not really, I think, who did not stop to think on the 7th of October, did not stop and look. They didn't really sit there and watch TV and say, what is actually going on here? And they didn't stop to feel, and they didn't stop to try and process it. What they did instead was to reach for their pre-existing political and intellectual frameworks and just to kind of put in today's events into them. And it is interesting that the anti-Semitism that began to rise very quickly on the 7th of October was, in the first place, a response to the attack of 7th of October. It was not a response to any kind of Israeli counter-action. It was a response to the action itself. It was a response to Jews being weak and vulnerable and subject to murder and subject to sexual violence and subject to kidnapping. It was a response to that which caused the initial spike in anti-Semitism, and I think we should take that seriously. So I think there were 4 responses. The first was glorification. Isn't this exciting? This is what the liberation will look like. The second response was really denial. There's nothing to see here. There's no untoward violence. There's just a slave uprising, a slave rebellion against the Israeli occupation forces. The third is a kind of trivialization. Well, yes, bad things happened, but compared to the real violence, it's not very important, and we should focus on that. And then the fourth thing is victim blaming, which goes from a very vulgar end, which says that the Israelis did it themselves, or the Israelis opened the border on purpose so that they could have a pretext for genocide, to a rather more sophisticated version, which says that when they saw what was happening, they were very quick to understand the potential for creating a pretext for genocide. And the charge of genocide is very important. Israel is no longer said to be apartheid. I was at an event of the European Sociological Association in Portugal a couple of months ago. There was a big opening plenary with about 2,000 of my sociology academic colleagues, and the argument that was offered to them was that apartheid was bad, but it was somehow moderated because apartheid was interested in extracting the surplus value of black labor, but Israel is not interested in the Palestinians for anything at all except for their land, and therefore Israel is inherently genocidal. In other words, Israel did not just commit genocide, but it is inherently genocidal. It was always going to commit genocide, and you can tell by reading Herzl's book. So those were the kinds of attitudes that we worry about. The thing that I have noticed very clearly over the last 20 years is that I think a version of what happened to me has happened to many, many other people. And that is, I remember very clearly sitting in sociology department meetings at Goldsmiths and looking around and being very proud to be one of those people, having a little bit of imposter syndrome and thinking, I'm one of these guys now. And I made a few arguments against the proposal to boycott Israeli academics, and I made a few arguments about anti-Semitism in relation to it, and suddenly I was no longer one of those people. I was, in a very British and understated way, frozen out, and I have more or less been frozen out ever since. This is not about me, however. I have seen this happen to people many times since. So in the Labour Party under Corbyn, anyone who stood up and raised the issue of anti-Semitism was immediately accused of being hostile to the Labour Party, and was immediately accused of being a kind of interloper in the Labour Party, and of being disloyal, and of being a Tory or a Trumpist infiltrator. And in that way, Jews were alienated from the Labour Party and made politically homeless. And I think something similar has happened to a lot of Jews since the 7th of October in the last year. A lot of people hadn't really experienced the kind of expulsion from the community of the good or the expulsion from the community of rational discourse themselves, but then they did after the 7th of October because it spread into spheres of social life that it hadn't been in yet. So a lot of Jewish people in Britain, I think, then experienced themselves being made into a pariah and being accused of basically treason and being accused of support for genocide. And that is the mechanism by which this kind of anti-Semitism operates.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, and really strong and a lot of questions to ask, and we'll tease some of that out and then over to all of you. But now, Linda, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to apologize for my husky voice. I contracted the mother of all viruses while on the plane over here. So 1,000 pardons for this. Know that I am, at this point, humbled to be here amongst esteemed colleagues, to be the only American on this stage, and also humbled by the enormity of what we need to do here. I will be honest with you that my first reaction was I have no idea how to commemorate October 7th I can't believe it's been a year. It's one of those events that I will always remember where I was. I was actually in Kyoto, Japan, of all places, when I found out about it, just as I know exactly where I was when I heard about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Certain dates stick with you. I don't know that I can bring comfort. I don't know that I can bring any sort of catharsis. What I want to bring is just the smallest bit of clarity to the part of the world that I study, and that is anti-Semitism in general, but specifically anti-Semitism on American college and university campuses, how that affects Jews, and also the period that I study is really post-1967 to the present. So just to describe the present time, to put some, even though words are not sufficient, to attach something to it, I want to borrow from the noted Holocaust and renowned Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer. In one of his later books, Professor Bauer came out with the idea that perhaps describing the Holocaust as unique was not as helpful, even though he and other scholars had done that for quite a while. And instead, he brought out the idea that the Holocaust was perhaps unprecedented. And that, in a certain sense, is the way I want to describe our present moment. I don't see it as unique because I believe there have been waves of this type of reaction since the post-1967 era, after the 1967 war. What I do find is that this is unprecedented in its intensity, probably also in its gleeful celebration of Israeli death, in the dehumanization of Israelis in general. So not unique necessarily, but unprecedented. Let me give you a little of my background. During the Second Intifada, in the early 00s, I was living in Israel. I was getting my doctorate there, and I was standing there and looking out at my home country, at the United States, and saying to myself, what is going on? And why is it that at a time of incredible hardship, for both sides, of course, but certainly for Israelis with suicide bombing, that there seems to be this complete reaction against Israel, against the humanity of Israelis. So I took that on as the subject of my dissertation. And my conclusion was this, is that after 1967, you have the new segments of the New Left at the time that developed a very binary way of looking at the world. And that binary said that Israel was an imperialist state, it was a European settler state. At the same time, and people, I think this is probably fairly well known, but at the same time, young Jews on American campuses and young adults were being singled out as being not only white, but the epitome of whiteness. Now, why is that important? Whiteness is kind of jargon that we use in academia today. When, at least in America, when do people become white? In other words, when do they become seen as part of the power structure rather than a struggling minority? So think about this. After the 1967 war, which was less than 25 years after the end of World War II, and of course the genocide of European Jewry, all of a sudden, Jews were seen as white. They were seen as oppressors. If the world was a binary between individuals or groups who are oppressed and individuals who are oppressors, all of a sudden, Jews were on that side. And as you can imagine, for many Jews, this was a bewildering place to be, even though, as we must acknowledge, that American Jewry in general had been very successful in that time period between 1945 and 1967. So because of this binary viewpoint, it has several impacts. So not only, essentially it's taken from American race relations, is where a lot of this comes from, is that minority identity groups, people of color we might say, or LGBTQ community members, women in a certain sense, that those are among the oppressed, and the white power structure is the oppressor standing against it. So not only is this paradigm completely inaccurate when we're trying to discuss a conflict in the Middle East, but it did something very unfortunate and important to Jews. Once you are identified as an oppressor, or to sort of have, as David mentioned, when you become the bad guy, the supporter of genocide, every conversation can be ended when if someone says something on campus that could be considered to be anti-Semitic or offensive to Jews, Jews don't have any recourse to respond because they're part of the power structure, they need to take it. They're not an oppressed minority. And I believe, this is my contention, that this started post-1967, and it has accelerated until today, until we get to the point on what we see on campuses and in other places. One of the big differences, though, if we're going to ask, how did we get from this time in 1967 until the present period, the conversations post-1967 among segments of the hard left or the new left were between students. This was not an issue that was consuming faculty or administrations. Discussions were extracurricular, and they were between different student groups. Today, what we see is very, very different because, of course, the students of yesteryear are the administrators and the faculty and the staff of universities today, and certainly that has been the case in the decades since 1967. So now, what Jewish students and faculty are dealing with is that these things are not just extracurricular, they're curricular, they're in the classroom. And they also are more difficult in a certain sense to combat. We have different rules, of course, in the United States than you do. Freedom of speech, academic freedom, I know you have those too. We just relate to them in a different way. And so it makes these conversations much more fraught, much more intense than they would have been in 1967. Now, for years, universities, we said, turned the other cheek in a certain sense with Jews. While they were very protective of microaggressions or rhetorical violence against other minority identity groups, the Jews were really left to fend for themselves because Israel, of course, was a political problem. It was not, it was something that other people were able to battle out. But if I can give you any slightly encouraging news, it is that I believe that that is changing and that university and college administrators are finally starting to take notice of the problem. Very quickly, because I'm at the end of time, look up or Google, when you can, TextGate at Columbia University. Arguably the epicenter of the problems that we have had on campuses, Columbia University, elite Ivy League, had an event where they asked speaking about Jewish life, the difficulties of Jewish life on campus. 3 administrators, deans, responsible for taking care of students, sat and texted each other about how this was all, these were privileged students, this was all essentially a facade, this was going to be great for fundraising. Those deans eventually were pressured to resign from their position. But the question that I would ask is, the people in charge of taking care of Jews and Jewish students, clearly their bodies were at the correct event, but their minds and their hearts were elsewhere. So the question that I hope we'll explore is, what does that mean for the situation today? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda. And the other question that I hope we'll explore is, what do we do about it? Because I think that's key, and that's a very good cue into Anthony.
I don't have to turn this on. No,
No.
it's on already.
It works by itself.
You can take the lawyer out of his office, but you can't take the. So I'm going to speak as I hope concisely as I can, and I'm going to make 6 separate points, a minute each, and that will give us a minute to just relax, because we need to do a little bit of relaxing, I think. Point number 1, kind of proposition number 1. I agree, this is a new reality. What that precisely means is for closer examination, but we are not going back to the 6th of October 2023. We're not actually going back to any moment in the closed season on Jews, which started in 1945 and then limped through 67 and 73 and 82 until I think 89 and the collapse of the whole socialist communist project, when a whole lot of disinherited people on the left looked for a cause. It's a complex history, but that period is over. And we're now, I think, in a period which has something of the quality of the second half of the 19th century, where Jews are, we live under legally emancipated conditions, but in in a kind of milieu of fearfulness and defensiveness and a certain apprehensiveness. Point 2. All the debate about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which I think all of us on this panel have been professionally engaged with for too long, I think mercifully, that's come to an end. It doesn't mean that people of profound stupidity and malice won't continue to insist on the distinction, but it doesn't matter because we now know that the current iteration of anti-Zionism arrives at the same lethal outcome as the worst kinds of anti-Semitism. So if you travel to that miserable spot by an anti-Zionist route or a more conventional anti-Semitic route, you're journeying to the same destination. I think those of you who saw the Daily Telegraph today, that short film of a man dismantling with a kind of focused anger a small memorial site in Brighton, we all of us, so those of us who saw it, the one thing we didn't ponder was, is he an anti-Semite or an anti-Zionist? Point number 3. A feature of our current new condition, I think, is that the faith, and here I'm speaking of Anglo Jewry, but I think it's also true of American Jewry, our faith in national institutions has fractured. And by national institutions, I mean, for example, the BBC and the universities, the Metropolitan Police, and so on. We no longer believe that we can rely on these institutions in our ordinary dealings with them, hearing the news, studying, and so on. We don't quite know where we stand, but we anticipate a degree of misrepresentation, a certain coldness, if not active hostility. It's somewhat bewildering. It's a calling for a recalibration of our relationship with those institutions, which in turn has implications for our own institutions. The Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council, and so on, they all exist in order to engage with those institutions. And I think that they continue to be bewildered about what to do now. Point number 4. We do not need any longer to debate with anti-Semites. When I was studying the history of English anti-Semitism, one of the most poignant moments in this awful history that I came across was a moment in the First World War when there was a lot of anti-Semitic rumor mongering about Jews avoiding the draft, Jews not contributing to the fighting effort of the country, and so on and so forth. Board of Deputies published lists and lists of Jewish soldiers who had fought and died. It was 16 or 17 after conscription. But many of those soldiers, those Jewish soldiers, had enlisted at a time when you came as a volunteer. The belief that anti-Semitism can be corrected by argument and fact, it should have died then. It occasionally revives. We, all of us, nurse it as a belief. I think that the 7th October, 8th October finished it, certainly in our lives, for good, and there is something liberating about that. Yes. I've been so disciplined.
Up to a point.
Up to a point, Lord Cobber. Two very quick more points then, last 2 points. Last point, first of the last 2 points. I think there's been a flattening of differences. notwithstanding what Linda said, between the US and Europe, and between the diaspora and Israel. US and Europe in the sense that, and then diaspora and Israel in the sense of a new understanding of our common vulnerability. And working through the meaning of that flattening and what it is to think of Israel as another Jewish community under threat, this requires a great deal of thought. Last point, and oddly and somewhat counterintuitively, because anti-Semitism is a generator of much confusion and chaos, I think post 7th October, we now have a new clarity of understanding, both in relation to the identity of our enemies, the identity of our allies, and the different tribes that the Jewish communities in the world comprise.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So I'm going to start with one of the points that Anthony made, because I think it's really important for all of us. And this is about faith in institutions. And by the way, I think that it's different. Faith in, if you like, universities, academia, is different from Jewish attitudes to the police, different again to what one would feel about the law courts, different again to what one would feel about a whole lot of other institutions. But let's just explore that a bit. To what, I mean, so many of us here will have been in synagogue over Rosh Hashanah, and our synagogues will have been protected by the police. So, I mean, to that extent, we have faith in the police. We are being protected by them. And I think that's probably quite important, even if we may not like some of the attitudes expressed by some members of the police. And I think that's quite important. What is the nature of that fracturing? And particularly, David and Linda, particularly what is that, the nature of that fracturing, if you like, amongst academics, so academe, and Anthony, can you address a little bit about what the students are experiencing? Because I think, I'm certainly in this country, that if you talk to people, it's not people of my generation and my children's generation. It's the students and the people up to about 35 who seem to be having the worst of the experience, the worst of the trouble directly. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect other people indirectly, but directly. So can we just, I don't know, David, whether you agree, but can we just tease out what's happening to academics, to what extent Jewish academics are being marginalized and indeed feel they're being marginalized? And Linda, can you talk about that in the United States? I think that's important. Anthony, if you can pick up on students, that would be hugely valuable. Okay.
So two things I want to say. One is to respond to the list that you just mentioned, which was the courts and the police and the BBC. I was always someone who rolled my eyes when people sort of shouted that the BBC was anti-Semitic, but I cannot listen to the Today programme anymore. And the reason I cannot listen to it is because I cannot see how someone who didn't know any better could possibly understand what was happening in Israel and amongst the Palestinians by listening to the Today programme. And also because of the emotional order, the sometimes actually straightforwardly the tone of voice, which is different when they talk to Jews and to Israelis and when they talk to others. So I'm not rolling my eyes anymore. But I think that the thing that links all of those things together are, in a way, the powerlessness of the people in charge. So I think university administrators and the people in charge of the police and the judges, I do not so much trust the judges anymore. We've had some really terrible legal judgments over the last 10 years. And you can go to a court and you can explain, you can produce evidence, you can produce a way of understanding what's happening, and they will look blankly at you like anyone else, like any colleague on campus, and they will say, well, you can't prohibit criticism of Israel, or you can't prohibit debate. So I think that there's a powerlessness in the people in charge who do not know how to oppose anti-Semitism, and actually who do not have the power to do so, because if they did, they would be up against insurmountable opposition. Secondly, quickly to answer your direct question about what it's like to be Jewish on campus, I think you raise a very important distinction, right? I don't think there's any problem with having a Rosh Hashanah celebration on campus, to having, you know, apples and honey, to having the police protect synagogues. That's not the problem. The problem is not having a Jewish name. The problem is not, you know, there are Jewish colleagues in my institution who do very, very well, who get bigged up by everybody and who get regarded as jolly good eggs. The problem is when academics take an interest in anti-Semitism, when they really pick up the corners of the rug and look what's underneath, and they try to understand anti-Semitism, and when they try to understand the anti-Semitism that has become normal within so many disciplines. So it's not about Rosh Hashanah, it's not about having a Jewish name, it's about what you say. And if you say that Jews in the Middle East are not deliberately murdering thousands of children, then you're in trouble. It doesn't matter what your name is, it doesn't even matter actually if you're Jewish or not, then you are excluded from the community of the good and the community of rational discourse. So that's how the exclusion works. And it's pretty powerful. I could name you only, I don't know, 3 or 4 academics in Britain who are earning a living doing serious work on anti-Semitism. And there are other people who are retired, people who earn their living somewhere else, people who earn their living doing other things in academia, but occasionally say good things about anti-Semitism. And it's very important because everybody knows there's a problem of anti-Semitism on campus. And all the kind of Jewish NGOs are trying to get into campus to do training for staff and students and lecturers. But the moment they go back into the lecture theatre, the moment they pick up their reading list, and Linda said this, it has moved from the students into the disciplines. And so this is really the important thing about what we at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism are trying to do. We are trying to have an impact within the disciplines, within the reading lists, within the regimes of publication and funding and career progression and mentoring inside the lecture theatre. Because if we don't get inside the lecture theatre, then the moment all our good work that we've done, the moment the student goes into the lecture theatre and hears what is being said, then there's trouble.
Thank you. Linda.
I don't know. Is this on? Yes. I don't know how many of you caught that. Well, I find it an irony that I am supposedly an expert on campus anti-Semitism, and yet I am not on a campus. I do not have and did not find an academic job, in part, and I'll take some responsibility for this as well, but in part because people were not interested in my research. When I knew that my attempts were, well, first of all, I got a doctorate in Israel, so that was strike one. But when I got a rejection letter from a Jewish journal that said, you write beautifully about your subject, anti-Semitism on American college and university campuses, but we don't agree with you. Now, naive Linda at that time said, well, that's what academia is about. We're supposed to have an open discourse with people with whom we do not agree. Well, that's not the way it worked. Most recently, I was employed by the U.S. Department of State. I am not employed by them anymore. I am not a spokesperson for them. So I think this problem has been around for quite a while. I did work at one point at an organization, American organization called the Academic Engagement Network. And it was grappling with the problems that faculty and administrators face in academia. It was started in, I think, 2015, 2014, to talk about how difficult it was to be out, if you will, about these issues and talk about anti-Semitism. There were more organizations that were dealing with students at that time. That was a given, that Hillel and Junior ADL and whomever else were dealing with students, but faculty had a real problem. And I was on my way out the door never to speak about anti-Semitism again when, and I won't tell you the whole complicated story, someone said to me, hey, there's a book contract at Routledge. They want a book on anti-Semitism written, and everyone in your generation was discouraged from writing about anti-Semitism. And I said, well, I don't want that book contract. Why didn't you call me 5, 10 years ago? And I was approached again, and I did write the book. There's a vacuum of people who simply were not allowed to explore these questions. Junior faculty that are intimidated and can't talk about the things that they want to talk about. Academic associations. We've had lots of wrestling matches with academic associations, modern language, English, women and gender studies that want to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS movements. I could go on and on, but let me wrap up with this. As far as, again, on college and university campuses, if someone paints a swastika on a Hillel building, everybody knows what to do. We get that, and we are out there. If someone repeatedly compares Israel, calls it the new Nazi state, administrators are absolutely flummoxed. And that is the difference, and one of the things I'd love to explore too is some of the ways that discourse, some of the rhetoric that's used by the extreme right and the extreme left, they come to a lot of the same ideas just from different avenues.
Thank you.
Just allow me to jump in
Okay.
and absolutely vouch for what Linda has just said about her own work and her own ability. And she was doing her doctoral thesis at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and it was hard enough there. Because even there, of course, Israeli academics don't want to be Jewish academics. They want to be academics. And I could name you a whole number of people, including Linda, who ought to have academic jobs and who don't.
And of course, the Israeli academics are more and more worried about being boycotted from doing the, if you like, the gravy train of going around the world and lecturing. And so they particularly don't want to pick up that issue. I think that's absolutely fair. That's completely right. Anthony, you're probably going to pick up on some of that, and then can you move to students, because that will be really helpful.
No, I mean, I have nothing really to add. Perhaps save in relation to the police. I think that there are two problems with the police. First of all, the prosecuting decisions, the way in which marches in particular are policed. I think they still give greater weight to considerations of order than considerations of justice. And what that means is the people who create the greatest trouble receive the most accommodation. And the second point is that I was in Frankfurt a few years ago. The shul there was only protected by police. Here, actually, our shuls are protected by the CST with a very, not as well, the shuls are protected by the CST with a very light touch police presence, often on a drive-by basis. Now,
Which shul do you go to?
There are no policemen standing outside shuls.
My shul. There's
well,
police
not-
standing outside.
Okay. No, I think, Julia, you're in a minority.
Maybe.
A show of hands for people at shuls where the police were not continuously standing outside over the Chagim. Thank you, is the answer. Now, as far as students are concerned, I think two things. First of all, students are having a really miserable time. It's not true that they're having a miserable time consistently across the board in all universities. My own university, to its shame, is one of the worst universities. And today has been particularly disgraceful. But if our students are going to continue to go to university, and they must continue to go to university, they need to be helped to actually understand how to engage as young adults other than as victims. And that's a very important role for older members of the community to discharge. The report that the group that it's a very great honor for me to chair, the ICPG, produced a report showing a very high, an intolerably high level of victimhood experienced by Jewish students. I very much hope, however toxic the environment is next year, that the students will have been helped to respond to that environment in a more confident and forthright way. It's up to us to help them. It's not a criticism of them, 18-year-olds, but it's a responsibility of the community at the moment. It's not clear to me that the community is here, as in so many other respects, rising to the occasion.
Okay. Everybody will have a chance to ask questions there. I think the community rising to the occasion is a really important message. I want to move to a different issue, which is when I talk to students and perhaps even more slightly older young adults, they're expressing a mixture of a sense of unease, uncomfortable, not quite sure how to handle all this, which reflects back on what Anthony's just said, and a sense of a real threat. And I'd just like to tease that out. I mean, Anthony, do you want to start on that one? That some of it is just very uncomfortable, and then and I think UCL may be one of the examples. In some places, students and young adults who, are still very much trying to make their way are feeling a real sense of threat. Can you tease that out a bit?
Well, I can certainly elaborate. Yep. So in the report that's available online, the students recount their experiences, which include being spat at, being shouted at, having their access to parts of the university or passageways within the university blocked. The Hebrew and Jewish Studies Department has received a number of death threats. There was a period when the lectures were notified to students by private text messages for fear of disruption. There are stationary protesters at entrance points so that Jewish students feel they have to run the gauntlet. It's all pretty awful. And of course the encampments and the slogans on the encampments are a constant site of demoralization. And because of this kind of pseudo hyper ethical discourse about complicity, all the Jewish students, other than those students who wish to belong, as David says, to the community of the righteous, are accused of being complicit with genocide. Now, what is more threatening? What could possibly be more threatening than to be told that one's complicit with genocide? A person who is complicit with genocide is a person who deserves nothing by way of regard, protection. A person who is complicit with genocide must run for his or her life. And so the students who nonetheless actually turn up to lectures are already showing a degree of civil courage, which is admirable.
Linda, do you want to pick that up a bit?
Sure. I wanted to go back to your previous answer too. It is clear that not every campus has the same, students are not experiencing the same thing. We have something like 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. Clearly, it is only a handful of them that are experiencing regular problems. Now, the fact that it's some of our most elite campuses is something that should give us pause. However, as far as students acting like victims, I believe personally that the victimhood culture on, I'll just speak for American campuses, has gone far beyond what it ever should have. That feeling oppressed is a badge of honor in a certain sense, and that's not just with Jews. I think that from what I saw from my research in 1967, Jews are merely, and I hate to put it this way, playing the game, which is this is the way it works on campuses, that to get attention or to get the support that you need to play into this oppressed community or this victim community. And there are various ways of doing that. And what Jewish students were saying, I think, is that we want ours because this is how everyone else is reacting. So for this,
Go on.
I think for the sense of the sense of dread. Let me give you an American example, and this is something we spoke about previously. some 70%, maybe 75% of American Jews, I think, vote pretty reliably Democratic. That's amazing for what we'd call a white ethnic group, the highest in the United States. Some of them are on the far left of that, and some of them are in the center. There's also the remainder, 25 to 30%, that are going to vote Republican, and there's going to be very different levels of comfort with the different issues that are taking place on campus. The problem for that big central mass of liberal, centrist liberal American Jews, which is where most of us, which is where I'd count myself and where most of us have been very comfortable, is that because of pressures from the left, you can be uncomfortable there. And I think this holds for our students too. However, joining with the right is, unthinkable, plus the fact that it's being influenced by a white supremacist side that has been empowered in recent years. So I think that what students are feeling is feeling politically homeless, and also many of them not very knowledgeable and horrified by what they're seeing on their televisions. They don't want to be supporters of genocide. They don't want to be called that. They don't want to feel that way. They might not feel much of an affinity with the Netanyahu government, but they still know that October 7th was, there are no words, again. So I think that's the trap that they're finding themselves in.
Yeah. I'm going to change the subject and put a completely different question to David, and then I'm going to throw it open to everybody here. So, David, you gave us the data. 25% really, basically, anti-Semitic attitudes, no question about it. 25% really friendly towards Israel, Jews, I think, as you put it. The 50% in the middle. I'm going to ask you to give us some thoughts about what can we do to, if you like, influence the 50% and try and move them to friends rather than enemies? That's a small question.
Yeah. Interestingly, that's really not my skill set. My skill set is not shifting public opinion. And there are people who are very good at that, I believe. And we should take them seriously, actually, and listen to people, who understand political messaging and that kind of thing. My skill set is in a very small, well, not so small as it was, in a small kind of layer of social life. And in a sense, my skill set is really very simple. It is just, as I said, to pick up the corner of the carpet and say, oh, look, this is happening. Oh, look, you just said this, or so-and-so just said that, or the person who's just written the new and very important book about genocide studies says we must decenter the Holocaust from genocide studies because it was put there by Zionism and by American imperialism in the time of the Cold War to make certain arguments about human rights. And systemic violence is really about the violence of colonialism against the rest of the world. And don't underestimate the power of fact creation. And it is really created as a fact that Israel is committing genocide. And many people don't, how do we know? How do we know about genocide? How do we know there was a genocide in Darfur? How do we know there's a genocide or genocidal culture amongst the Uyghurs in China? How do we know? And we do know. We know because the reporters and the journalists tell us. We know because there's evidence and we see the evidence. We know because the clever people tell us. We know because the NGOs tell us. We know because the UN tells us. That's how we know things. And all those people who we normally trust are saying Israel is committing genocide. I was in a first-year sociology class last week, first week, and I was asking students about research. Who pays for research? Is it government? And one of the students said, no, it's not government because government supports the status quo and sociological research challenges the status quo. For example, she said government supports Israel and sociological research would support Palestine. And I told my stepdaughter this and she said, oh my God, she said that in front of you. But as I am, I was very gentle, and I simply said, why do you think sociological research would throw up that result of supporting Palestine at the moment? And immediately she said, oh, no, well, I didn't mean to, I don't want to get into that. In other words, she had just repeated it as a fact, and a fact that she knew everyone would agree with. And she wasn't being controversial. She was just trying to make a point. And that was quite frightening. Of course, what I ought to have asked her is, what do you think Israeli sociology says? What findings would Israeli sociologists make about that? But that might have blown the mind of the whole group. I don't know. But the fact of genocide is very frightening, because, you know, people don't know the evidence. We don't know the evidence bit by bit about Darfur or about other cases, but we know because there are people in the culture who we trust, and rightly so. And the people who are trusted in the culture are saying that Israel is committing genocide like Nazis, that Israel is murdering children, as they were accused in 11th century Norwich and Lincoln. And that is the world we live in, and those claims are completely respectable. You know, I'm even afraid in this audience, as in any audience, to say this is a blood libel, and it has become completely respectable. And I'm afraid, because it sounds mad, but it just happens to be true, that it is respectable to come out with those blood libels at the moment. And that really speaks to what Anthony said about we are in a period in which, I can't remember how you articulated it, in which the gloves are off, in a sense.
And people don't know what genocide even means, which makes it even more complicated. So when you try and unpack it, they look at you as if you've completely lost the plot. Nor do they know that the term was coined by a Jew, of course, which is another level.
Who must be decentered.
Quite, naturally. Okay, we have a certain amount of agreement on this panel, you may have noticed. I'd like the lights to be up, or at least such that I can actually see you, because that'd be quite good. And then we've got a chance for people to ask questions, not make statements. How do I put that even more strongly? We haven't got terribly long. We've probably got about 20 minutes. And could I see, because I can see somebody at the front, but I can't see much. Wait a minute. Can I see anybody further back? Can you? Yeah, I can see somebody waving right at the back. Okay, you first, and then you at the back. And people have got, there's some stewards coming round with roving mics, so we'll take it like that. And do say whether you want the whole panel to answer or whether you want one individual member of the panel to answer. It's coming to you, but you need to wait for a mic. Okay, someone at the back has got a mic already?
I have a mic. Can you hear me?
Well, then you go first and you go second when you get the mic.
All right. Thank you so much. Wildly fascinating panel. I will have only one question, even though I have many. And I wanted to put a premise to the panel. I don't know if it's a good premise, but I thought I would test it. The premise is anti-Semitism flourishes during times of economic, political, and social instability. Of course, I'm thinking of 1930s Germany, but fast forward to today, we all read the news, and just to make the premise a little bit more controversial, I see the presence of a country like Qatar donating significant sums of money to universities.
Sorry, we need a question.
So that's the premise, is that part of the social instability, economic instability, is that Western institutions are looking outside themselves for support, whether it's in educational institutions, legal institutions, and so forth.
Okay, does the panel agree with you, is I think the question. Anthony.
If the question is, does anti-Semitism increase in times of political instability? The answer is, it's too general a question for me to give an answer. But my sense is that anti-Semitism contributes to political instability. And it is popular not so much when times are unstable as when times are perplexing, because it provides all the answers.
Because you can blame one particular group.
Well, the French anti-Semite, Charles Maurras, who was active at the end of the 19th century, said everything about the modern world is impossible to understand until you understand that the Jews are responsible for everything that's bad in it. And then everything becomes clear. So anti-Semitism is a kind of illegitimate heuristic, a way of getting to understand what's going on. That has compelling appeal in times that are unstable or stable.
Linda.
I would agree with that rather than, instability, of course, contributes, but I think actually it's a perception issue as well. Look, as you probably already are, at our election cycle, my election cycle coming up, not yours, and you see two parties with completely different conceptions of an America that is stable and prosperous and has a bright future, problems but a bright future, and another one where it's an America that's collapsing and the laughing stock of the planet and that we need to go back to a better time. Certainly, now both of those parties have difficulties with anti-Semitism in different ways, and it's based on the perceptions of their followers. So I would add that I think political polarization, when times are difficult and we can't agree, adds to the problem as well.
David.
I dare say everyone, full stop, and everyone in this room and everyone else has some kind of a rational and genuine grievance about something or about somebody. And I suggest that they should address it, and they should address it rationally, and they should try to find a solution to it. But what they should not do is say, oh, it must be the Jews. And in that sense, it's very simple, that I'm not so much interested in trying to sort of take away every rational and material grievance that everybody has, although, of course, if people have material grievance, then we should address that rationally and politically. What I'm interested in is how material grievance transforms itself into the politics of anti-Semitism, and not only anti-Semitism in our time, because the rise of anti-Semitism is a part of a more general rise of populism, of conspiracy fantasy, and anti-Semitism is overrepresented, can I say gently, on the left and amongst Islamist-type politics. But there are other kinds of very threatening conspiracy fantasies that are really, really rising on the right, and I think they are related to each other.
Thank you. Lady at the front. Then somebody just behind you. Guy there. And then, if we have time, lady in the front. Sure. Okay.
Yes, a question for Anthony and Julia. And I just wanted to respond, Anthony, something you were saying earlier, that it really is the adult's responsibility to help young Jews in this country, and I completely agree. However, we rarely hear a Jewish voice in the media. And the conversation we're having this evening, I rarely hear on air or in the media. The reason I'm directing the question at the two of you is I want to hear from your experiences and your attempts, perhaps, or what your experience is in trying to convey how serious this problem is for young Jews in this country. In other words, I think we as adults need to model for young Jews how we dig deep to find our courage to stand up for ourselves. And I think that needs to begin with people who have the ear of the media. So I want to hear your experiences with either the BBC or the print paper and what that's been like for the two of you and why we're not hearing more from Jews.
Okay. Anthony, you go first and I'll take it afterwards, and we'll have to be fairly quick.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't find it difficult to be in the write an article or be interviewed, and mostly I say no. So I'm sorry, does that sound, I'm not sure how it sounds, it's just a fact. So I don't feel that kind of role modeling is the way, because I think younger people need to understand themselves how to behave in a certain way and to be given the tools and not simply to be encouraged to imitate.
Okay, so like Anthony, I probably turned down an awful lot. I did the Sunday programme yesterday because it was marking the anniversary of 7th of October. I'm obviously chairing this today, but this is very much for a Jewish audience. I rather agree. I think it's something else that we need to do as the grown-ups, and that is modelling behaviour. But that's not modelling behaviour in the media. There are plenty of Jews out in the media. You know, read Johnny Friedland or Simon Sharma, or there are plenty of people out in the media. That's not the point. The point is about how do you get people to put away the victimhood and stand up strong. So, I mean, one of the things that we did on first day Rosh Hashanah was, so my colleague David Mitchell was preaching about Jewish pride and being proud of being Jewish. And we ended the service, not only with the final blessing, but with everybody saying, Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and be of good courage. And there is something which I think we need to model for younger Jews, which is about standing up proud and not actually, you know, to hell with you, F off, don't behave to me like that. And I think we need a bit more of that, I'm sorry. But actually, I think that's more important, really, than being in the media. And I think, and just to finish that point, because I think it's really important, that everybody here can be part of that. I think it's encouraging people to take them on. Don't put up with it. It's not okay. The other side of that, and that's why I actually asked David about the 50%, is there have been an astonishing number, I think, of non-Jews who have reached out to people in the Jewish community. I'm particularly touched, actually, by my Irish friends who have reached out, because I wasn't expecting that. There have been. I think we need to recognise that and celebrate that. So the two things are stand up and be proud and recognise our friends. Buy them a box of chocolates or a bunch of flowers. It's quite a good idea. Okay. You're next, I think. No, sorry, behind you. Yep. We need a mic right here. Mike? Okay.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, not trying to quash your positivity with anything negative, and I know we've spoken a lot about the young Jewish people. However, I think that there's been like a big focus on how the media is in terms of like state-run media, the BBC, but it's not really the media which young people are looking at, and I feel like a lot of the members of this audience aren't on Instagram maybe every day as much as young people maybe my age are. And the things that you're essentially fed every day is, as you said, demoralizing. You're seeing essentially
Okay, can we have a question?
Every single person you know, you're seeing essentially posting this stuff which is completely against what you believe in. And despite the my question is, how, when you're faced by complete darkness, even though you may be able to say F off, how can that actually change the perceptions of the people around you in the long run, and how can that change for Jewish people?
Okay, so I just want to start by saying I think there's a real issue about what happens on social media, be it Instagram, be it to some extent, you know, Facebook, most people don't use that anymore, but I think there's a real issue about social media, and I think it's partly because it's an echo chamber, so it keeps on repeating itself. I think one of the answers, Anthony might be able to say more about this, is one of the answers I think is that some of it has to be regulated. I actually think that's important, and I think we've been wimpish about that and not taking on the big media companies. And I also think that some of you, young Jews, need to take over a bit of that messaging and fight back. And I think that might be uncomfortable, but I think it needs to happen. But I don't know what my colleagues think. So, Anthony.
I mean, I think that there is a kind of general problem that the leadership in the community is out of touch with the realities of the modern forms of communication. I mean, it's a really serious problem. And of course, it's much greater than questions in relation to anti-Semitism. It's just true generally. The legislators are making decisions about modern media without any understanding of what modern media actually comprises. There isn't perhaps lowering the voting age to 16 might be one way of ensuring that people who actually understand what it is that they're using have a greater impact on legislators. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out, but it's not something that's capable of a 1-minute answer. You raised an exceptionally important point.
Yeah, and I think the whole question about how social media works matters a lot. Would either of you like to contribute? Anything you want to say?
I'm a bit funny because often I can study genocide and stuff like this, and it kind of washes over my head and it doesn't particularly affect me, and sometimes I get moved by something I'm not expecting to be moved by. And I'm quite moved at this moment by the idea of victimhood. And I remember on Saturday morning on the 7th of October, I remember putting the telly on and I remember seeing, I think her name was Ada Yafa, the oldish, well, the old lady, let's be fair, the old lady who was being driven around in Gaza on her mobility scooter. And the BBC commentator said, oh, we think that she's probably has dementia because she's smiling and she seems to not really know what's going on. And when she was released many, many days later, she said, I knew exactly what was going on. And my way of standing up against what was going on was by not appearing to be like a victim. And that's very moving. And we can all remember the other footage from that first day of people, of Israelis being forced into victimhood, who were not used to it, who thought of themselves as strong and tough and able to stand up for themselves, but Israel kind of looked at what was happening and thought, it's not like that today. And I think that the 7th of October is absolutely about people being transformed completely into victims. And they were, many of the people in those kibbutzim were people who were really tough, strong peace activists. It made zero difference. And I think that the guy at the front, I'm not going to use your name because I've been told off for using people's names because it makes us all look pally. I think your point is really well taken, that when somebody comes to me and says this anti-Semitic thing has just happened to me, a student or a colleague, and it's miserable. I was in South Africa last week, and one person said to me, oh, no, she'd written a brilliant piece about the anti-Semitism that she saw on the demonstrations. And I said to her, did that draw a load of anti-Semitism down onto your head? And she said, no, not at all. Not at all. And then we were talking later about a boycott motion that was coming up at her university. She said, I'm not sure of the wording. And I said, well, ask the committee. They'll tell you, you're allowed. And she said, oh, no, I can't do that because I might be fired. So on the one moment, she said to me, no, there's no anti-Semitism at my university, everything's fine. And then she said, but I can't ask for the wording of the motion because I might be fired. And I think the one advice that I give people when they come to me is be careful about speaking out. Because if you speak out, really awful things might happen, and it might be the end of your career. Or be careful about writing a dissertation about anti-Semitism because it might prevent you from getting that first or that 2-1 that you want. And so a kind of duty of care makes me feel like kind of warning people. And one other person I met in South Africa too, I could see that his career was on the edge. He was a really smart 30-something academic. He was clearly somebody who was a very key part of his discipline of you know, basically left-wing responses to all kinds of things that are going on in South Africa. And I could see that from what he was saying, he was terrified of having his career and his membership of the community of academia ended. And I felt awful for him because I thought this happened to me such a long time ago. And then I kind of just ignored it because I was actually quite unthinking about what might happen to me. Happened to me such a long time ago that it doesn't really get to me like that anymore. But when I see it happening to people right now, today, it makes me want to not tell them what's going on, what's happening to them, because it feels awful.
Linda.
Very quickly, on social media. Well, my take on this is that crap is crap, and it's been around for a long time. When I wrote my master's thesis on Holocaust denial, pre-internet era, and I went through all of this garbage that was circulated, periodicals, zines, letters, the way we did things in the Stone Age. The crap was still there, it still got around. Once again, it's not unique. What's going on now is unprecedented. It's that speed, it's that immediacy. It's, you can, Twitter or X, you can say something dumb every moment of the day if you want to. It is overpowering. Like David, too, I'm somewhat emotionally callous to this. I can read a lot of terrible things, and I need to remember that it bothers other people. It gets under the skin of other people more than me. I do think that there's more and more of an awareness of the social media can be a helpful tool of the toxicity of it. So I'm saying, I truly hope. I mean, there are always the trolls out there that are putting crap out there, but more and more people are hopefully just as skeptical about that. I'm hoping, guys, stick with me, hopefully just as skeptical about that as they are about the mainstream media. One last thing, I have no idea how old you are, but there's a...
23.
How old?
23.
23. So that's great. So if you look at the generation of the 1960s, the New Left radicals that really had radical thoughts in the United States, Jerry Rubin turned out to be an investment banker. They all went, Bobby Seale selling a line of barbecue sauces. I mean, these were really serious, intense radicals, and people change. The only person I've heard brag that he has not changed any of his opinions since he was a teenager is former President Trump. But most of us actually, and he does see this as a mark of consistency.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Take this for what you will. People change, and so when people are very, very upset about what some students are saying, I'm just going to tell you, I'm really glad that social media wasn't around when I was 18, because I really am glad that none of that was recorded. People change, and I'm just trying to give you some hope. Take it for what you will.
Right. I think that's a great point. I think the other thing that we all ought to bear in mind is one of the things that's so difficult about social media is that the rules of publication don't apply, so you don't have to have your name, and it's extremely difficult to find out who the authors are. And that is one of the things that makes it easier for hatred to be perpetuated. And we could go into that in great detail. I'm not going to go there, but that is really important. We've got time. You're going to have to be seriously quick. Wait, you've got to wait for a mic. But, yeah. Doesn't matter.
Hello.
They can't hear you at the back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The question is, I came here tonight because I have a lot of friends who are totally blind to what is going on, and they don't understand our point of view. How do we give our point of view in a way that draws them in instead of them armoring up?
Do you mean Jews or non-Jews or both?
Non-Jews. Well, we've got Miriam Margolis on the Jewish side, who's not much.
We've got a few on the Jewish side. Don't worry about that. We always have some.
Non-Jews.
Okay. Do you want to try that, Linda?
Oh, yeah, I'll try Anthony first.
Okay, Anthony first. Okay. You've got.
And you.
Okay.
Well, I have absolutely no idea how to answer that question at that level of generality. If there is a particular person who you know who doesn't understand what's going on from our point of view, and then if by some miraculous chance you think they're open to understanding another point of view, then no doubt you would know them well enough to know how to do it. But my sense is that we are now engaged in a kind of dialogue of the deaf, and that much energy is expended to no point in Hasbara style advocacy, and that is not actually where we should be focusing our efforts.
Okay, I'm going to give each of our panelists like 1.5 minutes for a final comment. But before I do, I just want to answer you. I do think it's worth taking them on. I always think that if you can convince one person, it's at least one person who isn't going to have some of those attitudes. So I always think it's worth taking them on. You may have fewer friends than you thought. Equally, you may find people that you didn't think were going to be your friends will be your friends. I think it's worth having the argument. I can't go into the details of how, but I think it's worth having the arguments. That's all I'd say. I'm now going to go to each of our panelists for one final thought, and then we are going to have to wind up, sadly. David, Linda, Anthony, in that order.
So in answer to that question, I would buy them a copy of our 3-volume book, Responses to the 7th of October. Me, Linda, Anthony all have pieces in it, and many, many other people. And actually, that's important. We are writing books that can help people to defend themselves politically. And I want to finish with something else, which is that humanitarian law was and is really important. But it does not do what lots of people think it should do, which is to stop pain and to stop people from suffering in war. It does something quite specific. It is an instrument that attempts to stop, to regulate what is allowed during war and what is not allowed during war. But it does not prohibit war, and it does not prohibit the wrong side in war. And I would say that it's really important that we remember that, because these terms about war crimes and genocide are being used wrongly, but they also hide another harsh reality, which is that war is awful. And I can tell you, we are very much concerned about remembering what happened on the 7th of October. A very close friend and colleague of mine, an academic, was supposed to be here tonight, could not come here tonight because his partner had heard the news that 4, I think, or 5 members of his family who live in Sidon had died in the last day or two. And suffering is very serious, and war is very serious. And we should take a moment also to remember that. And we should understand the distinction between that and deliberate, large-scale, genocidal murder.
Linda.
So I don't know how to conclude, in part because the work does not conclude. It will be with us always. But I do want to say, as someone who worked in a number of American Jewish professional organizations, I called myself a professional Jew. There is a certain percentage of people that we know are unreachable. They cannot hear our story. They don't want to hear our story. And there's a certain point where you walk away from that. And I have a really terrible answer for you, for everyone. I'm going to continue to be me. Me feels free to criticize Israeli actions if I want to, but feels free also to defend Israel with every fiber of my being. Me feels free to say what I feel. Now that's very optimistic. Sometimes it's frightening. Sometimes it feels dangerous. But I am so thrilled to have the support of friends and colleagues in my country, friends and colleagues in this country. We are out there. And it's not just Jews. There are non-Jews who are with us as well. And we cannot, even in the most difficult times, we will never forget that.
Anthony.
Well, I was, when David asked me whether I would join this panel, first of all, I always say yes to David, so in a way it was, but then I thought, why? First of all, I have no greater grasp of what's going on than anybody else. I mean, we're all trying to understand it, so why sit and sound off? And secondly, I thought there has to be a space in all Jewish assemblies. There has to be a space on the 7th of October for just silent reflection and respect. So I would like to just dedicate my last minute to that.
So that is exactly what I was going to say. I thought we should finish just with a moment of silence, and then I'll call it to an end. But I also wanted to echo something that Linda said. I think it's really important that we're ourselves and we stand up, and there will be lots of people who'll be with us and there'll be lots of people against us, but we just have to be ourselves. I'm now going to ask you to have, maybe 30 seconds of silence, and then I'll thank the speakers and people get a chance to meet them afterwards at the cafe if they'd like to do it. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers for actually, even if you think that it's something we all have to wrestle with, you actually have thrown some light and made us think. So thank you to David, thank you to Linda, thank you to Anthony, and thank you to all of you.
And of course, a huge thank you to you, Julia, for being here with us this evening. As I said at the start, the books are available to buy just outside on the other side of this wall, and if you'd like to get them signed, you can do. The cafe is open to continue this conversation or silent reflection out there. I'll also invite you, those of you that would like to, if you came over the bridge and have seen our Lovelock Hostage Bridge, we have still more padlocks. We've purchased some more padlocks. They're up there. If you'd like to add your message on a padlock and attach it to the bridge as a gesture of love towards the hostages, please do. And apart from that, please thank our security on your way home, because people don't thank them enough. And without them, the Jewish community couldn't run at the moment. So thank you.